Hi, today we're with Deanna Watson, Executive Director of the Boise City Ada County Housing Authority and an alum of Boise State University. Deanna, thanks for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you.
I always start out by asking people to tell us a little bit about how you ended up at where you are at the Boise City Ada County Housing Authority.
Okay. Well, I have to go back to my undergraduate days at Boise State. I started in the social work department, thinking I wanted to be a medical social worker and maybe eventually become a hospital administrator. But the further I got into the social work program, the more I realized that that line of work would put me under the constraints of the policies and regulations that govern social work. And I got involved in student government at Boise State and began to see the ways that you could actually um, influence and change policy within the framework of regulations to actually change the way things are done to help more people or to be more efficient in what you do. So I switched to political science, ended up spending time at every student government office practically that you could, student body president, 83, 84. And that was just a great microcosm for me to see what you can do on the policy side. Um, After I graduated, I went to work for Micron Technology and learned a lot about quality control. But I was on a great path that wasn't taking me where I wanted to go. And so I had an opportunity to go to work for the state housing finance entity, Idaho Housing and Finance, and started working in homeless programs and then in rental assistance programs administered through branch offices located around the state of Idaho. In 1997, after a lot of controversy and kind of tabloid news about the former executive director of Boise City and Ada County Housing Authorities, they did a nationwide search, couldn't find the right person for the job, and after about 8 months, one of the board members made contact with me, another Boise State alum, said, "Don't you work in housing? What is it you do? Why haven't you applied?" At that point, I felt like the board was relying on HUD to oversee some of the cleanup, and I thought HUD was as guilty as my predecessor. So I expressed that. They said, "No, we get that now. Just give it some thought." And so in February of 97, I became the director where I'm at now. So that I didn't know even that housing authorities existed when I graduated from Boise State. So I didn't have my eye on this, but it has enabled me to be involved at that sort of foundational level with policies, and have had the opportunity to serve on some national committees to actually work with those who are working with Congress and putting together laws for how to administer programs. So that's sort of how I ended up here.
Maybe we'll do another call about the corruption that happened in the 90s, and it's a great fable about how not to do things, I think. So in some of my classes, we've talked about the history of the government, the federal government's involvement in trying to provide low-income housing. And we began with the construction of what really were human-sized kind of garden-style public housing in the Depression. And by the 1949 Housing Act, we were seeing what was then called urban renewal, really focusing more on commercial development in downtowns and less about low-income housing. I think we tore down several 100,000 units in slum clearance and really only built about 20,000 to replace them over the 20-year period of the heyday of urban renewal as the solution for public housing. And of course, then we went through the big projects, right? The projects phase in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And then by the end of the 70s, the federal government is really out of building those big projects, right? Yeah. And so your agency represents kind of the menu of things that we are trying to do now in terms of federal and state and local partnerships to provide housing. So could you give us an overview of what kinds of things the Boise City Ada County Housing Authority does, and do we have like any big buildings, like the project's still in operation here, and so on?
Sure. So the Boise City Housing Authority was created in 1967. And so that was sort of maybe a little past the height of the building of low rent public housing is what it's referred to in the HUD nomenclature. But the first two projects of the Boise City Housing Authority were two high rises in the north end, one down near the federal building, between there and what used to be the Baird's Cleaners and the co-op. 7 stories, 93 units. The big debate in 1967, 68 was, would old folks want to live in a building with an elevator, or would they be too scared? And so there was a design competition. Boise Cascade had more of a, like a cottage plan, but they ended up going with this high-rise concept. Capitol Plaza, 93 units, Franklin Plaza over, block back from State Street near the original Albertsons at like 16th, 17th, and Franklin is a 67 unit, 5-story high rise, originally designated for people who were elderly, and then later on became elderly and or people with disabling conditions. And I would say from the time that I started, those two properties used to be almost entirely elderly. Now they're almost entirely people with disabling conditions and almost entirely on the mental health side, with a few mixed in of elderly, which carries its own challenges for the people who live there and for the people who try to administer the programs. So we have those two. And then in the 70s, we built Shoreline Plaza, which is an 80 unit high rise, 5 stories over off of Shoreline and Americana area by the post office. And that's under a program that is called Section 8 New Construction, which was a really dumb name to give something that was built in 1978, but it's one of those federally funded programs that runs a lot like the low rent public housing. Same population served. In each one of those, people pay about 30 to 40% of their income toward rent and utilities. We make up the difference, and we are the owner property manager of those properties. So we do some public housing, but that's the smallest of the programs that we administer, partly because the funding for those kinds of projects really had dried up by the mid 1970s, because the decision was made, rather than trying to build housing owned by a governmental entity or a quasi-governmental entity, we're going to give portable assistance to people so they can take that voucher that's worth a certain dollar amount based on what their family unit size is, and they can find a landlord on the open market to rent to them, and they'll live right next door to somebody who maybe is paying their full rent, and they'll be exposed to maybe a healthier way of life. And so that we'll have about 2,200 families who are participating in what's commonly referred to as Section 8, but also Housing Choice Voucher. And it's portable both locally, where somebody can rent from a landlord, say down in the north end, and then move because they got a job in Meridian, take that voucher and move there. Or if they get a job in Des Moines, Iowa, they can take the voucher and go there. It's portable across the United States, as long as there's a housing authority that serves that area. There's about 3,400 of us around the country that administer these programs. So that's the largest of the programs that we have. And then in the late 1990s, when there really wasn't additional funding opportunities for Section 8, there became some little niche funding opportunities on a different department side of HUD that carried rental assistance with supportive services for people with extra challenges besides a lack of income. So HOPWA, housing opportunities for persons with AIDS, BASH, assistance for homeless veterans. One program was called Shelter Plus Care. Basically rental assistance with supportive services for people with severe and persistent mental illness, chronic homelessness, those kinds of things.
Mhm.
So we have about 375 to 400 rental assistance kind of vouchers, although they're not really vouchers, but we'll call them that. That's just, they can move into the community and rent from somebody and have case management services along with it. And then in the last 5 years, we've really gotten involved in providing Section 8 vouchers attached to actual buildings. So there's New Path, which is a Housing First property in downtown Boise, and Valor Point, which is a BASH project-based property on State Street. So for those, the idea has been, it's really difficult for people with lots of challenges to find a landlord to work with them and be successful. And so we provide the operating funds through our rental assistance that goes to the owner of the property. And then there's case management and supportive services, and moving from saying to somebody who's been homeless for a long time with maybe chronic mental illness, substance use disorder. We used to say, get yourself stable and then we'll try to get you into housing. Now this reverses it and says, let's get you into housing so you can get stable. Mm-hmm. And so we provide the operating funds for those two properties. So those are sort of I think the main programs that we administer that have come into being since really the 30s and 40s. Really when the federal government first started to see a role in providing affordable housing, and you go back to the Shipping Act of 1917 when they had to provide government housing for workers who were building the ships for World War I, and then that sort of opened the door to the 30s, and so we're a quasi-governmental. A lot of people think we're a division of the city or the county. We're actually not. Our funding is almost entirely federal, but we answer to a board of commissioners who are appointed locally by the county commissioners and the city of Boise. And so there is local kind of control and accountability, but we're not a nonprofit. We're not a true governmental entity. We're sort of in between those.
But you operate within, as if the government transparency requirements and so on were in place. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, we have to have a lot of systems in place. So that, and we operate under Public Records Act, public meetings. I mean, most of the ways we operate are governmental, but we're an instrumentality of local government. And so I always think of us as like an amoeba. We don't really fit cleanly in any one category, but we can sort of just slide back and forth across the lines from time to time.
Well, there are all kinds of agencies that are like that. I think the public administration people call them quangos, the quasi governmental organizations, and they're an interesting group because in some cases we create them on purpose to avoid the paperwork, and then when there's a problem, we wonder why they're not complying with transparency or whatever. And I guess out of transparency, I should say that I was a commissioner on that board of governors there for you for, I don't know, 8 years or so.
Not long enough is all I know.
Well, when you teach at night, it turns out that you miss a lot of meetings. So that, it was an honor to serve. We have about 2,200 people that are on those Section 8 vouchers, and that number is really not dependent on you, but dependent on what HUD, the Federal Housing Agency, decides is the correct number. Is that right?
That is right. It's based on annual appropriations. So each year Congress has to make a decision about how much they're going to provide to HUD, and then HUD has 60 days after Congress has decided the amount they will receive to apportion that out across the country. And so one of the complicating factors for us is that very rarely in the last 20 years has Congress passed a budget before the beginning of the fiscal year. And so some years we go 6, 7, 8 months into the year before we know what our operating funds are for that year. And we are greatly impacted by rent levels. If, like the market right now is incredibly hot, and landlords can kind of set the price wherever they want, and people have to just try to figure out how to meet that. We are capped on how much we can pay on behalf of families in our program. And so after the first year in the program, and I may be getting into the weeds here, but this is one of the quandaries we have. After the first year in a lease under our program, the landlord can bump the rent up way higher. And the idea is the tenant can say, well, I'm not going to stay living here, I'm moving out. But if there's no place to move because the market says this is the price, it's not impacting what we pay, it's impacting what the tenant pays. So for instance, downtown Boise, the Idaho converted hotel to apartments. We have had people living there in a tax credit property with a rental assistance voucher, paying over 70% of their income toward rent and utilities, because they have their 30%, we have our ceiling amount, and then anything above that goes back to them to have to pay. And so it's truly not an affordable housing program when you can't control all the variables that come into how you determine what somebody's going to have to pay. Yeah. And so that's been just a heartbreaker for us to see those impacts and to know that people are, they're almost like on an island. There's no place for them to go. And so they just continue going without more and more and more, and putting their own health at risk because they had to pay the rent. They couldn't pay for the prescriptions.
Yeah, that is heartbreaking. When I was a commissioner, there were often extensive waiting lists such that every 5 or 6 years, you would just have to purge the list and start over. Is that still the case in terms of people waiting to get a voucher?
We've changed the way we administer the waiting list, partly because of budget cuts, and we couldn't afford to have as many staff doing the work. And when we get our waiting list up to 5,000 to 7,000 families, we had to keep track of all of them as long as they were on our waiting list. So if they moved, if their job changed, they had to report it, we had to adjust. And so what we've gone to now is a lottery system where every 2.5 years, we open the closed waiting list for about 7 weeks and bring in new applications and cap it around 2,500 to 3,000. And then over the course of a 24 to 30 month period, we make our way through that list. So if somebody looked at our waiting list 8 years ago and said, wow, you had 7,500 families on the list then, and now you only have 1,800, great job. No, it's just because we closed the doors, except for about 7 weeks every 2.5, 2 years. But if people get on the list, they know that within that 2-year period, they're going to come up to the top and we can get them assistance, rather than saying, well, it'll probably be 5 to 7 years to somebody who's in crisis today. And so that's been, I think, an improvement. Although times like these, when people are in dire straits and can't even get on the waiting list, they can't move because they can't get in. It's still a difficulty. And we can help about 20% of the people who are eligible and in need, and that's true across the United States. So once people get on the program, they can stay on the program as long as they need the help. And so, there's like the entry point, and then there's either because their life got a whole lot better, or they broke rules to the point that they lost their assistance, or they passed away. That's the way there's a new opening for somebody off the waiting list to come into the program.
So if 2,000 people get in the lottery, how many people buy tickets? How many people are trying? Are you saying I'm not real good on math on my feet here?
Yeah. I would say that we know that there are a lot more people who are eligible and in need than ever get an application into us. And so if you look at the poverty rate for Ada County and see what that number is, and then see that we're helping around 2,200 families. Now, some of those are, they're in mortgages that they're struggling to make, and so they wouldn't necessarily come into our program. But if you look at the poverty rate and say, you know, I don't know what the number is now, 22, 24, 25,000 families, and the Housing Authority can help 2,200 of them with their rent and utilities. So what happens is we try to just mass market when our waiting list is open, contact all of our community partners, television, you know, kind of information pieces, radio, blah, blah, blah. But we miss so many people, and so many people we're trying to reach are not, they don't have a television to watch. They don't have, you know, access to the day-to-day,
Right.
up to the minute information. And so I know we miss a lot of them that way. And then of course, you know, with just the tremendous growth and people getting sort of pushed out of where they're at. The last time we had the downturn, you know, we had so many investors come in and purchase what used to be affordable apartment complexes and go in and, you know, put, I don't know, countertops in that are, you know, the high end, and then say, no, we don't take Section 8. You have to make 2.5 times what our rent level is for us to even look at your application. And so, and you know, the other thing that we see a lot of is what used to be naturally occurring affordable housing, some of the older, maybe big homes that got subdivided into smaller apartments that now are being sold for the value of the land.
Yeah.
We'll have maybe 31 people that were living in affordable housing now pushed out with 31 fewer units available for them to try to find to rent. So that's the other, and of course, you know, low-income housing tax credit properties that have to keep an affordability in them for, you know, 30 years, but only have a 15-year period in which there can be a penalty for not following the rules. And so those that end up like Idaho, that can raise the rents, and they can be told you're not supposed to do that, but there isn't any penalty clause now to get them because they've already received all the funding that can't be taken back. So
it's really a 15-year requirement.
Yeah, they can get a better deal if they say we'll do it for 30. But the neglect, in my view, has been in not having some kind of a penalty clause after that 15 years for not doing what you said you would.
Yeah. The mayor, Mayor McLean, has made access to low-income housing one of her things she's been trying to focus on. Of course, she was only in office a month before COVID, so you know there hasn't been a lot of time to focus on it. But we do have this project where the Housing First is in. You've been in the game of housing for a long time. How do you feel about that shift in philosophy away from, okay, let me fix all of your mental health issues and substance abuse issues, and then we'll find some suitable housing too. Let's get you in the housing, and then there'll be these wraparound services there. It's certainly more popular nationwide than ever. How do you feel about it?
I'm in favor of the idea of getting people stabilized, and you know, really creating that atmosphere for which they can begin to take a breath. Because if, you know, if every day you're on the streets in all kinds of weather, and maybe you have untreated mental illness, substance use, combination of things, I don't know how somebody's supposed to get stable.
Yeah.
Where I think we struggle with where we draw those lines is we offer access to supportive services, but we don't require that somebody take advantage of those. And then there are the I guess the array and depth of services that nobody has access to if you don't have insurance. You know, even if you have Medicaid, you might not be able to get to. So what we're experiencing in the housing, in the living environment for people who carry an awful lot of baggage from just life experience and what's happened to them in the past, is a level of dysfunctionality sometimes that gets exacerbated by the fact that their neighbor also is struggling with the same things, and the person down the hall, and you know, that kind of thing. So where do we draw the line between If you signed a lease, you have to comply with the terms of the lease. But what if we've signed a lease with somebody who the best they can do is sign a lease, but they're not going to, we've got, hoarding and I know there's a psychological basis for that. And I would bet that people who've been homeless and then have housing suddenly want to surround themselves with everything they can to try to, protect themselves. So that becomes an issue for property management to deal with. And now we've got, fire exits blocked and those kinds of things. And when we try to reach out for mental health services that aren't there, we have that in a lot of our high rises where somebody will every few months have to go to a state hospital for a while, and they come back and they do fairly well for about a month. And I can kind of track, and then I'm back calling the mental health folks at the police department because of criminal behavior that's based on untreated mental illness. And they will say, well, yeah, the shot's worn off. So they get to a stable enough point that they can give them some kind of an injection, and then they release them back. And so really, housers provide what we become sort of the de facto providers beyond what we're trained to do. I'm not mentally health trained. I've learned an awful lot just because I've been in this business now for about 30 years. But when those resources aren't there, and we want to give people independence to make their own decisions, it's sometimes we end up in between a rock and a hard place for what to do to try to keep people housed.
Well, a set of stories that really stick with me from my time on the board were when mental health issues would be leading the clients and participants into, bizarre behavior or threatening behavior. And, I remember there was a man in the high rise who called down to the staff, and he said, there's a woman in my freezer, right?
Yeah.
And so the staff person is thinking like a little one that's talking to you, like a delusion, or Mrs. Smith down the hall is now, in shrink wrap in your freezer, which, and we're still working on, as local government experts, right, at figuring out how to keep people from falling through the cracks with these things, because housing administration people aren't necessarily, they're not going to be counselors and mental health professionals, and at least not at what we pay you all. So, to have people double certified is kind of hard.
Yeah, it is. I think that's probably the most difficult part of our work is meeting people where they are and knowing that we don't have the resources, nor do we have partners in the community that have the resources to really be able to help people where they are and where they aren't. So I think that's one of the big stressors for us as housing providers is, everybody else can kind of walk away, but they live with us. And so we see, sort of just the heartbreak of their day-to-day experience sometimes of not having the resources they need, not having the tools that they need. COVID has had a major impact on people's lives where they already live in maybe tiny little apartments, and they used to have the common area they could go have a cup of coffee and interact with others, and we've shut all that down. There's no visitors coming in other than care providers, and the mental health stress kind of triggered behaviors have taxed all of us a lot more when we're more remote than we have been in the past.
Yeah. Some of the social justice events this last summer focused on, what people were, I think it's an unfortunate name, but calling it defund the police. But it's brought up some interesting ideas and brought to light some programs like in the city of Eugene, where there are these mental health folks that work through the police department that respond to acute episodes, and so you're not showing up with everybody in riot gear and with guns, but rather mental health professionals. Is there something like that here in Boise or in Idaho that you're aware of?
There is, and Boise Police Department has a mental health kind of unit that currently is one officer and one mental health expert. Um, and I mean, we call on them on a very regular basis. And oftentimes when we're first experiencing something with somebody, they've known them already for 2 or 3 years, from time in the parks and at Interfaith Sanctuary and that kind of thing. There just aren't enough of them. Yeah. But I can tell you that before we had them, it was really kind of a crapshoot when we needed to call the police, whether we were going to get somebody who was compassionate and recognizing there's something that is keeping this person from seeing the same reality that I am. And it's not always drugs. And then somebody who would go the extra mile and continue to keep communication with us about what they were seeing. We have a program participant of ours right now who is on our assistance program and living in one of our apartments, who we have not seen since mid-November. And we know that she suffers from a very high level of paranoia. I first met her when I was doing an inspection in her apartment, not in one of our apartments, just helping out. I try to keep myself fresh with my certifications and go do housing inspections. And, her life story was one of just, sexual abuse by step siblings. Parents were both alcoholics. She was a prostitute in Seattle just for survival from her early teen years. She's now like 60 years old. She's had a lifetime of really being a very vulnerable adult, just bouncing from system to system. And we were able to get her into housing, get things kind of stabilized. She was on her way to get a dog, which had been a real, lifesaver in the past. She's disappeared. And I have, we've contacted, the police, the state hospitals, the mental health hospitals. We don't know where she is. And
she's not in the apartment, though.
She's not in the apartment. We've checked there. We've kind of, made sure we know kind of what the condition of the apartment was. So if she maybe is back and then leaves again, we'll know that. But those are the dilemmas that, you could check in once a week and I'd say, well, now this week we've got this thing going on, but it's very distressing to, she's on the voucher program, so we're still receiving partial rent, but we don't have any idea where she is. Her car's gone. She didn't have any family, any social supports. So
oh, well,
I don't know how I got off on that, but
I hope that story ends well. Well, it's part of, that larger conversation of how mental health is like everybody's problem and nobody's problem,
Right.
And
Right.
so it does not, we don't do a good job. And, when a person has multiple problems going on at once, it's very difficult to get them in the right silo, even if we had adequate
Right.
funding. Interesting.
Yeah.
So I hear you take interns occasionally at the agency. Is that right?
We do. We
Good.
do. Yes.
And they would contact you if they were interested?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, we may be looking for some interns here pretty quick.
That's what I understand. Well, I love it when students develop a passion for something as they're in school. Increasingly, I meet students for whom housing and low-income housing or the impacts of gentrification or whatever are interesting to them. And I'm so glad that we had this chance to talk today, Deanna, and give students a little bit of a look at what one of our best agencies at addressing housing and low-income housing and what you're doing and getting a look at your programs. Thanks so much for meeting with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity every time to talk to people who have an interest in what we do, because I think it is incredibly interesting and much more in-depth than somebody on the street would ever recognize.
Absolutely. And thank you for all that you do. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Okay,
Bye.
you too. Bye.